Now we're getting really close to the end result now, and all we need to do is start getting our skills section laid out in a way that looks a little bit better than this. So the first thing to notice is that if I switch on pesticide, you can see that we've got the skill section, and inside the skill section there's two divs. And if you look in the code, then you'll see exactly the same structure here. So this div is the skills div, which contains two further divs, which are the skill rows. And if you prefer to visualize this a little bit easier by seeing which is the opening tag for the div and which one is the closing one, you can actually head into Atom and change your preferences in your editor section to show the indent guides. So now you can see that you've got these lines that show you which div matches with which closing element. Now, I actually prefer this off just because I find it too cluttery, but it all depends on how you wish to visualize it. But the important thing is that we've got these two divs that represent two skill rows. And I want you to make each skill row have only 50% the width of the screen. So at the moment it's 100% because it's a block element, but I want you to change that to make it only 50%. So pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so this shouldn't be too hard. If we head into our styles.css and we go ahead and add our skill row, and just make sure that you check to see if you've got any typos between the way it's named here in the class attribute and the way that you've targeted it over here. So we want to change the width to 50%, and we can hit save and refresh, and you can see that even though our width for the div is now 50%, because it's no longer 100%, it's no longer centered in the middle of our website. So how can we fix this? We've seen this before, and as a challenge, I want you to restore this skill row to the center of the web page. So pause the video and see if you can figure out how to do that. So as we've seen before, the way that we achieve this is by setting the margin to be auto on the left and on the right. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can set the margin for this skill row to be auto, and that just means auto on all four sides, which will center it if we refresh our web page. Now, at the moment, that div is a little bit too close to the top heading and to the next div. So how can you change the margin property so that we end up with a 100 pixel margin at the top and a 100 pixel margin at the bottom, but keeping this margin auto on the left and right? Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so this goes back to the circle shorthand. So if we start from the top, as we always do, we're going to add a 100 pixel margin at the top. Next, we come clockwise to the right, which we want to keep as auto. Next, we go down to the bottom, which we said again we want 100 pixels margin. And finally, we have the left, which we are going to set as auto. So the left and the right are auto, the top and the bottom are 100 pixels. Let's hit save and let's refresh, and we can see that margin now in action. Now, the next thing that I want you to do is I want this text, both the part for the design and development as well as the description text, to be left aligned. So can you figure out which property you need to change and where in order to make that happen? So pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so all we need to do is to go into the skill row and change the text align property. Remember, we changed this previously to make the text center aligned for most of the body, and that in itself aligned the images to be centered as well as all of our text. But in this skill row here, we want the text to be left aligned. So we can change that value to left, and that will override the center text align in the body. So now if we hit refresh, you can see that our text inside the skill section is now left aligned, but outside of it, it's still center aligned. Now, the next thing I want to do is to make the paragraph, so the text in here, a little bit more spaced apart by changing the line height. So can you double the line height by changing the line height property? So pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so in this case, we're again going to be inside the skill row and we're changing the line height property to 2. And remember, in this case, we don't actually have any units and we're simply specifying a scale. Let's hit refresh and you can see that our text is now a lot more spaced out and much easier to read. Now, the last thing I want to do before we look into the positioning of our skill row is we need this image to be a lot smaller. So go ahead and change the width of the image to 25%. All right, so in order to target the image, we need to specify their class names. So one is called code-image and one is called chili-image. Now, this is just the classes that I've added for my own images. You might have named these classes differently because you might have different images. Just check what you have as your class name before you start implementing this and make sure that it works. So I'm going to cluster that with the other images. And the first one is called code-image. And I want to change the width to 25% of its parent. And the next one is the chili image. And this again is going to have a width of 25%. Let's hit save and let's refresh. And you can see that they are now the same size, even though they weren't before, because they're now scaled down based on the width of their parent, which in this case is actually the skill row. So it's now a quarter the width of the skill row, which itself is only 50% the width of the entire page. So now comes the really interesting thing. How can I make my text wrap around my image? So I want this skill row to be a lot stouter, so less in height, and I want this image to be on the left, but I want my text to be on the right of the image and wrapping around the image as necessary. Well, this is where the topic of this lesson comes in, and that is, of course, floating. So we can make the image float to the left of the text and make the text wrap around it by simply changing one property, and that is the float property. So if we go into our code image and we change the float property to float left and we hit save, once we refresh, you'll see that our image is now on the left of our skill row and our text is now wrapping around the image in order to display both of these on the same line. Now, it looks a little bit odd having the text right up next to the image. So can you figure out a way of having 30 pixels of space between this text and this image? So pause the video and see if you can complete the challenge. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You can think about padding or margin. In this case, in order to apply a margin to the text, it would be kind of difficult because they're completely separate at the moment. We've got an H3 and we've got a paragraph. Now, you could add a div to wrap them together and add a left margin to that div. But what's much easier is to simply add a margin right to our image. So let's head into our code and change the code image margin right property to 30 pixels. And once we refresh, you'll see that our image now has a bit of space between it and the text, because it's wrapping around and now it has less width to be displayed, it's actually taking up the full width of that div, and this looks a lot better than previously. Now, as a challenge, I want you to use the same principles of floating to make this image appear on the right over here, and for the text to wrap around that image and to have the same amount, so 30 pixels of space between the image and the text. So pause the video now and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so pretty much the same principles here, but in this case, we're not floating left anymore because we want it to be on the right of the text. So in that case, we have to change the float property to right instead of left. And that will mean that the text will wrap around the image on the left. And then we just have to add in that margin left of 30 pixels on the image in order to get it to have the same amount of space as we had up here. So this is looking pretty sweet, and we're getting very, very close to our end result that we're looking for. Now, sometimes when you float an element, you might not want all of the text to be wrapped around it. So, for example, say if we only wanted that title to wrap around this image and to be on the right of the image, then we can actually use another property to make sure that this text does not wrap and end up at the bottom over here below the image. And that property is called clear. So if I target the paragraph here, let's give it a class, let's call it maybe code skill description, and I'm just going to copy and paste it down here. And if I use the clear property to clear its left side, then that prevents it from wrapping anything on the left. So let's go ahead and try that. Clear left, hit save, refresh. You can see that that paragraph is now pushed to below the image, which is floating. But that heading, that H3, is still wrapping around the image that's floated to the left. If you think about clear as almost like the anti-float, then that starts to make a little bit more sense. So we're saying that float this image to the left and all text will wrap around it on the right. But for this paragraph, we said to clear its left, which means make sure that that left margin is clear and not wrapped around anything. Then that basically prevents it from carrying out the default behavior. Now, as a challenge, can you make this paragraph appear below this image rather than wrapped around it? Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so it's exactly the same concept here. Now, let's go ahead and just give that paragraph a class. Let's call this chili skill description. And again, I'm going to copy it, save the file, and paste it down here. And of course, remember that dot in front because it's a class. And in this case, I still need to use clear, but I have to clear its right side in order to make sure it doesn't wrap around the image. Because you can see that if I tried the same thing and I cleared its left side, nothing changes because it's not wrapping anything on its left. But if I change this to right, then you'll see that it now appears below the image and it's prevented from wrapping the image that's floated to the right. Now, I'm actually going to go ahead and clear both of these CSS rules because I actually prefer the look that we had previously, and I'm going to get rid of these classes as well. And this is the final result that we want to keep. Now, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. Float is one of the most commonly used and abused CSS properties. The thing to remember is that it has a whole bunch of corner cases, and I recommend to only use float when really, really necessary, and only use it for what it's meant, which is wrapping text around a certain element. And don't use it for positioning. Instead, use what we learned about positioning, like relative or absolute positioning, or using the margin and the padding for the layout and the positioning of your website, and to leave the float property only for the cases of wrapping text. Then you will surely get into less trouble and less problems than if you try to use a float just as a sort of free-for-all layout property, which you see a lot of people mistakenly do. So we are really, really close to the end of this module. And in the next section, I've got a challenge for you to look at a specification of how we want the website to be finally laid out. And instead of me guiding you step by step through all the little properties that you need to change, I want you to figure out what you need to change in order to achieve the layout that I've specified. So in the next lesson, you'll see text instructions for you to complete the final big challenge and get this website looking beautiful. So for all of that, I will see you on the next lesson.